The first sign of trouble wasn't the silence of the woods or the snap of a twig that didn't sound like a squirrel. It was the whistle, a high, thin sound that cut through the humid air like a razor, followed by a solid thump. Evelyn froze. Her hand was halfway to the water pail she'd dropped by the creek. Her knuckles were white. Her heart, which had been beating with the slow rhythm of a summer afternoon, was now a drum against her ribs. She looked down. Not 3 inches from her worn leather boot, an arrow was buried deep in the dark, damp earth. The feathers at its end, a shock of black and white, seemed to mock her with their stillness. She didn't scream. The sound was trapped somewhere in her throat, a knot of pure, cold terror. Her eyes, wide and wild, snapped toward the dense line of pine and shadow at the edge of the clearing. And that's when she saw him. He stepped out from behind an ancient oak tree, materializing from the shadows as if the forest itself had given him form. He was tall, built of lean muscle and quiet intensity. He wore buckskin that clung to him like a second skin, and his bow was still held loosely in one hand, not quite raised, but not lowered either. His face, a canvas of sharp angles and weathered strength, was painted with stark lines of black and red that made him look like a spirit of vengeance. His dark hair was woven into 2 long braids, and his eyes were fixed on her. They were dark, steady, and utterly unreadable. This was it. This was the moment her father had warned her about in his whiskey-fueled stories at the saloon. The savage in the woods, the demon waiting to drag her away. Every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn and run, to scramble back toward the flimsy safety of the settlers' camp. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Because as he took another step forward, she saw something that defied all the stories, all the warnings. It wasn't malice in his eyes. It was something else, something ancient and profound and sad. It held her there, pinned in place more effectively than any arrow ever could. He moved with a grace that was both terrifying and beautiful, a silent predator closing the distance. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze never leaving hers. Then he bent down, his movements fluid and economical, and picked up the wooden pail she had dropped. He held it out to her. His voice, when he spoke, shattered the world she thought she knew. It was low, smooth, and in perfect, unaccented English. "You drop this." Evelyn could only stare, her mind racing to catch up. The demon from her father's tales didn't offer to help. He didn't speak with the calm of a summer river. Her own voice was a dry whisper, scraped from the bottom of her lungs. You startled me." A flicker of something, was it amusement? Crossed his face. "So did you." She reached for the pail, her trembling fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm, real. Not the cold touch of a monster, but the solid, living warmth of a man. The shock of it was like a jolt of lightning. For a dizzying second, the world narrowed to that single point of contact. Her fear was dissolving, replaced by a raw, dangerous curiosity. "Are you watching our camp?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned her face, as if searching for something. "Or me." She pressed, the words bolder than she felt. This time, he didn't even flinch. His gaze was so intense it felt like he could see right through her skin, past the fear, and into the secret, lonely corners of her heart. "You're the only one who looks with your own eyes," he said, the words hanging in the air between them, heavy with a meaning she couldn't yet grasp. And then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned. He didn't run. He simply melted back into the trees, the shadows swallowing him whole until it was as if he had never been there at all. Evelyn was left alone by the creek, her heart hammering for an entirely new reason. The arrow was still in the dirt. Her pail was in her hand. But the world she was standing in was no longer the same one she had woken up to that morning. Something had changed forever, and she had a terrifying feeling that this was only the beginning. That night, The campfire at the settlers' camp felt smaller. The darkness outside its ring of light felt deeper. Her father, a man whose face was a permanent road map of anger and suspicion, was holding court. He slammed his fist on the rough-hewn table, making the tin plates jump. "Land deeds! That's what separates us from them!" he roared, his voice thick with cheap whiskey. "We build, we tame. They just exist, like weeds, savages who don't understand ownership." His words, usually a source of grim comfort, now felt hollow and false. Evelyn stared into the flames, but she wasn't seeing the fire. She was seeing a pair of dark, steady eyes. She was feeling the ghost of a warm hand against hers. She was hearing a voice that spoke not of savagery, but of seeing. Her father pointed a grubby finger at her. "You were out by the creek too long today, girl. It ain't safe, you hear me? They're out there. Watching. Waiting." "I can take care of myself," she muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "Like your mother did?" he snapped, and the air went cold. The name of her mother was a forbidden word, a ghost that haunted their small, miserable cabin. He never spoke of her, except in moments of rage, and always with a bitter poison that suggested a story Evelyn had never been told. She thought she was safe, too. She was wrong. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air snaked down Evelyn's spine. There was a darkness in her father's grief, a jagged edge she couldn't comprehend. Beside him, a man named Silas Mercer chuckled. Silas was a new arrival, a land speculator with soft hands and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was everything her father admired, wealthy, ruthless, and contemptuous of the wild land and its people. "The girl just needs a firm hand, Jebediah," Silas said, placing a proprietary hand on Evelyn's shoulder. She flinched away from his touch. "A good husband to keep her mind on proper things. We can discuss the arrangements soon." Her father grunted in agreement, and a wave of nausea rolled through Evelyn. They were talking about her as if she were a mule to be traded, a piece of property. The thought was suffocating. She couldn't sleep that night. The warrior's words echoed in her mind. "You're the only one who looks with your own eyes." Had he seen this? Had he seen the cage they were building around her? The next morning she knew what she had to do. It was reckless. It was madness. But the alternative, a life shackled to Silas Mercer, a man who made her skin crawl, was unthinkable. She slipped out of the camp just after dawn, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, and made her way back to the clearing by the creek. She didn't know why she expected him to be there. She just knew she had to go. And he was. He was sitting on a fallen log, carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable as always. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "I'm Evelyn," she said finally, her voice small but clear. He didn't offer his name in return. He just watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice the same low rumble she remembered. "Then why are you?" she shot back, a spark of defiance igniting within her. He didn't answer. But he didn't leave either, and in that shared silence, something fragile and dangerous began to take root. They met again the next day, and the one after that. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a growing understanding, a connection that ran deeper than words. She learned his name was Takakota, son of the Lakota Chief, the next in line to lead his people. A prince of the very wilderness her father sought to conquer, and she was the daughter of his enemy. Their secret meetings were a flame in the dark, a desperate, beautiful rebellion. But they were both smart enough to know that a flame that bright can't stay hidden for long. People talk, people watch, and in a world built on lines drawn in hatred and fear, love was the most dangerous trespass of all. From the ridge above the creek, Another pair of eyes watched them. Kaga, Takakota's cousin. His face was a mask of cold fury. He watched Takakota smile, a rare, fleeting thing that only seemed to appear when the white woman was near. He saw the way she looked at him with an openness that Kaga found disgusting. This was the weakness he had been waiting for. Takakota, the golden son, the future chief, was poisoning himself with this settler girl. He was betraying his blood, his duty. And Kaga knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this betrayal would be Takakota's downfall, and his own rising. He crept away, a cruel plan forming in his mind, a plan that would use their secret love to set a fire that would burn both their worlds to the ground. The whispers started like a slow-burning fever. In the settler camp, women would stop talking when Evelyn walked by, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Men would stare, their expressions hardening. "Jebediah's girl has gone wild," they'd murmur. "Spends too much time in the woods. She'll bring trouble on us all." Her father's anger grew with each passing day. He saw the light in her eyes, the secret smile she couldn't hide, and he knew its source wasn't from his world. It was a look of defiance. It was the look of a daughter slipping through his fingers. The pressure from Silas Mercer was mounting too. "A wedding date, Jebediah," he'd say, his voice smooth as oil. "Before the girl's reputation is completely ruined. A man has his own reputation to consider." The cage was closing in. Evelyn felt it every night, the walls of their small cabin pressing down on her, the weight of her father's rage and Silas's expectations suffocating her. The only air she could breathe was in the forest, with Takakota. In the Lakota village the murmurs were different, but no less potent. Kaga had been planting seeds of doubt with cunning precision. He spoke of Takakota's frequent absences, of a strange new distance in the chief's son. He didn't mention Evelyn directly, not at first. He just let the poison spread. "His spirit wanders," Kaga would say to the other young warriors. "He walks a path that is not our own." The elders saw it too. Takakota, who was meant to be learning the sacred duties of a chief, was distracted. His mind was elsewhere. His heart was not with his people. One afternoon, they met under their usual cedar tree, its branches a canopy of green against the blue sky. Takakota had carved a small, intricate spiral into the bark, a symbol he said represented the journey of the soul. "My father has noticed," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't have to explain. The bruises on her arm from where he'd grabbed her the night before were hidden beneath her sleeve, but she knew Takakota could see the shadow of them in her eyes. "He says I come back different." Takakota's hand, which had been tracing the spiral, stilled. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You are different." The words hung between them, a simple truth that held a world of complication. "Am I a fool for this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For coming here? For wanting this? Knowing what they'll say? What they'll do?" "No," he said, his voice low and certain. He turned to face her then, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "Fools speak of love without understanding its cost. The brave love, even when they know it will burn." She stepped closer, the space between them humming with a dangerous energy. "What will your people do, if they find out about me?" His silence was an answer in itself. After a long moment he spoke, his voice heavy. "They will call it betrayal. The fact that I am to be chief, it makes it worse." He looked away, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "My cousin Kaga, he watches me. He wants what I have. He would use you to destroy me." The name sent a chill down her spine. She had seen Kaga once, a warrior with eyes as hard and cold as river stones. She had felt his hatred from a distance. They sat on a log by the stream, the water gurgling over the rocks, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. He drew the shape of a bird in the dirt with his finger, its wings outstretched in flight. "You don't talk like the others," she said, desperate to change the subject, to hold on to this fragile peace for a moment longer. "You don't look at me like I'm something broken or something to be conquered." "Because you're neither," he replied, his eyes on the drawing. "You listen. You carry silence like a strength, and you ask why when most people only demand answers." Evelyn bit her lip. What if that's not enough? What if love isn't enough to save us? "It never is," he said, and her heart sank. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. "Unless it is willing to walk through fire." The air crackled. The world seemed to hold its breath. "I'd walk through it," she whispered, the words an oath, a prayer, "if you asked me to." His own breath caught. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so gentle it was almost imaginary. But she felt it everywhere, a fire that spread from that single point to every nerve in her body. "Then you should know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "I have carved your name into the center post of my lodge. My people do not carve names without meaning. It is a promise." Her eyes widened in shock. "A promise, a binding. But we haven't—" "I do not need more time," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "to know what is sacred." He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not soft or gentle. It was desperate and hungry, a collision of two worlds, a defiance of all the rules that were meant to keep them apart. It was lightning and thunder and the breaking of a dam. It was the beginning of the end, because as their lips met, a twig snapped in the undergrowth behind them. It wasn't an animal. Takakota pulled back instantly, his body tensing, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. His eyes were no longer those of a lover, but of a warrior. "Go!" he said, his voice a harsh command. "They're here, Kaga!" He pushed her behind him, shielding her with his own body as he stared into the shadows. "Run, Evelyn, now, before they speak your name to ears that will twist it into a weapon." She hesitated for only a heartbeat, her mind reeling. But the look on his face, a cold, deadly calm, spurred her into motion. She turned and ran, not looking back, the feeling of his kiss still burning on her lips. The shape of the bird he'd drawn seared into her memory. This was no longer a secret romance. It was a war. A line had been drawn in sacred earth, and they had just crossed it. And as she crashed through the woods, she knew with a sickening certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The blood was coming. Kaga didn't show himself. He was smarter than that. He let Takakota stand there, a warrior ready for a fight that wouldn't come. He simply watched from the shadows as the girl fled, his lips twisting into a triumphant sneer. He had what he needed. He had seen the kiss. He had seen the promise in their eyes. He had seen the weakness that would break the chief's son. He slipped away, silent as a hunting cat, leaving behind a single, deliberately placed moccasin print in the soft earth. A print that was not his own. It belonged to a warrior from a rival band, the Red Stones, known for their aggression. A perfect piece of misdirection. When Evelyn burst back into the settler camp, gasping for breath, her hair wild, her clothes torn by branches, she ran straight into Silas Mercer. His grip on her arm was like iron. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low, mocking purr. "Look what the cat dragged in. Been for a little stroll in the woods, have we?" His eyes raked over her, cold and possessive. "Let go of me," she hissed, trying to pull away. "Your father and I have come to an agreement," he said, his smile widening. It was a predator's smile. "The wedding will be in 2 weeks. It's time you were tamed, my dear. For your own good." The words hit her like a physical blow. 2 weeks. The cage door was swinging shut. Her father appeared behind Silas, his face a thundercloud of fury. "You disgrace us," he spat. "Running around in the woods like an animal. Do you have any idea what they are? What they do?" "You know nothing about him," she cried, her voice breaking. "I know enough," her father roared. "I know what they did to your mother." The world stopped. Evelyn stared at him, her mind blank with shock. "What? What are you talking about? You said she died of a fever." A flicker of something. Was it panic? Crossed her father's eyes. Silas stepped in smoothly. "Grief makes men say things they don't mean, my dear. Your father is just upset. He only wants to protect you." But Evelyn wasn't looking at Silas. She was looking at her father, and for the first time she saw the lie. It was there, in the frantic way his eyes darted away from hers, in the tremor in his hands. He was hiding something, something terrible. The story of her mother's death was a lie. That night, the Lakota village fire burned high, but the heat couldn't touch the ice in the air. Takakota stood before his father, the chief, and the council of elders. Kaga stood at the edge of the circle, his face a mask of false concern. A moccasin print of a red stone warrior was found near the creek where you walk, Kaga announced, holding up a drawing. The same place where the settler girl is often seen. They are growing bold. They encroach on our lands, and our chief's son does nothing. The chief's gaze, heavy with the weight of his people, fell upon his son. "Your spirit drifts from us, Takakota. Kaga says you meet with the settler's daughter. Is this true?" "I meet with a woman named Evelyn," Takakota said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. He would not deny her. He would not hide. A hiss went through the council. "They are poison," an elder spat. "They cut down the sacred trees and scar the earth. She will fill your head with her people's greed." "She brings no greed," Takakota replied, his voice ringing with conviction. "She brings only honesty. She sees the world as it is, not as her people want it to be." "She does not belong here." His father's voice was like gravel and stone. "And you do. You carry our blood, our stories, our future. You cannot throw it away for a ghost-faced girl." "Must I carry our hatred forever, then?" Takakota challenged, his voice rising. "Is it betrayal to love someone who sees the man, not the chief's son? Or is it only betrayal because she was not born of this land?" "She is born of the war," Kaga shouted, stepping forward. "Her people are the reason our scars are still fresh. You honor her, you dishonor the memory of every one of our people they have killed. So we punish her for the sins of her father?" Takakota shot back, his eyes flashing. "Do we become the monsters they claim we are? Or do we choose a different path? A path of strength, not of fear?" The chief looked at his son, his face a mask of sorrow and stone. "You would give up your future, your birthright, for her?" "No," Takakota said, his voice dropping, but filled with a power that silenced the entire council. "I would build a new future. With her." A heavy silence fell over the fire circle. Kaga smiled. It was done. Takakota had chosen the girl. He had sealed his own fate. Back in the settler camp, Evelyn made her choice. She couldn't marry Silas. She couldn't live under the shadow of her father's lie. There was only one path left. She packed a small satchel with a loaf of bread, a skin of water, and the small, sharp knife she used for skinning rabbits. Then, under the cloak of a moonless night, she slipped out of the cabin and into the whispering darkness of the trees. She didn't know if he would be there. She just prayed. They met at the creek, drawn together by an invisible thread of desperation and hope. The look in his eyes told her everything. He knew. His people had turned on him. "They'll come for us," he warned, his voice grim as he took her into his arms. The feel of him, solid and real, was the only anchor in her spinning world. From both sides. They will not let this stand. "Let them," she whispered, burying her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke and him. We have lived in their shadows and their silence for too long. They held each other under the vast, star-dusted sky, two fugitives from two worlds, their only crime being love. They were no longer the chief's son and the settler's daughter. They were just Lakota and Evelyn, and they had only each other. But as they stood there, a new kind of war was beginning. A war not of arrows and guns, but of whispers and lies. Kaga had told the council that Lakota had run off to join the white woman, abandoning his people, and Silas, enraged that his prize had slipped away, told the settlers that the savage had stolen her, bewitched her, and would surely kill her. Two search parties were formed at dawn, one from the tribe, led by a furious Kaga, hungry for blood and power. The other from the town, led by a vengeful Silas, his rifle loaded and his face twisted with rage. They moved in opposite directions, two arms of a pincer movement, fueled by hatred and deception. And caught in the middle were Evelyn and Lakota, running for their lives. They ran. For 2 days, they moved through the deepest parts of the forest, the parts of the wilderness that even the most experienced hunters avoided. They moved north, towards the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, a place of sharp rocks and treacherous winds, a place no one would think to look for them. Lakota moved with a grim purpose, his senses on high alert. He taught Evelyn how to walk without leaving a trace, how to read the signs of the forest, how to listen to the language of the birds. She was a quick learner, her fear honing her instincts to a razor's edge. They ate berries and roots, drank from hidden springs, and slept in short, restless bursts, huddled together for warmth in the cold mountain air. "They will be tracking us," Evelyn whispered one night, as they took shelter in a shallow cave behind a waterfall. The roar of the water masked their scent and sounds. "Your cousin, Kaga. You said he is a great hunter." "He is," Lakota said, his arm tightening around her. "But he is fueled by hate. Hate makes a man predictable. He will look for the easy paths. We will take the hard ones." But there was another hunter she feared more, Silas. She couldn't shake the image of his cold, dead eyes, his predator's smile, and her father's words haunted her. "I know what they did to your mother." A lie. But what was the truth? What terrible secret was he hiding that was so awful he had to invent another? "Lakota," she murmured into the darkness. "My father. He lied to me about my mother's death. He blamed your people, but it wasn't true. I saw it in his eyes." Lakota was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes the deepest wounds are not from an enemy's arrow," he said softly, "but from the secrets kept by those we love." On the 3rd day, they saw smoke. Not the thin, controlled smoke of a hunter's fire, but the thick black plume of a signal fire. It was on the ridge to the south, the way they had come. "Kaga," Lakota breathed, his body going rigid. "He is signaling the other party, the settlers." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "They're working together?" "No," Lakota said, his eyes narrowing. "Not together. Kaga is using them. He wants them to find us first. He wants them to be the ones with blood on their hands, so he can return to the tribe and claim I was killed by the white men I chose over my own people. He becomes a hero. And a chief." The cunning of it was sickening. Kaga and Silas, two vipers, using them as pawns in their own dark games. They were trapped, boxed in. The mountains were at their back, and 2 hunting parties were closing in from the front. "Do we run?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Lakota said, a strange, hard light in his eyes. "Running is what they expect. We have been the prey for too long." He looked around the small, defensible clearing where they stood, a natural fortress of rock and pine. "Here, we make our stand here, together." He pulled her close, his hand cupping her face. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something." before they come." "What is it?" she asked, her heart pounding. "The arrow," he said, his gaze intense. "The first day by the creek. I was not aiming for you." She stared at him, confused. "What?" "There was a copperhead," he said. "In the leaves, right behind your foot. It was coiled to strike. I didn't have time to shout. I only had time to shoot." The world tilted on its axis. All this time she thought their meeting was an accident, a threat that blossomed into something else. But it wasn't. He had saved her life. From the very beginning, he had been her protector. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of shock, of understanding, of a love so deep it ached. He hadn't just stolen her heart, he had saved her from the very start. And that's when they heard the shouts, the baying of hounds, the cracking of rifles being cocked. They had found them. The clearing erupted into chaos. Silas's men burst through the trees from the north, their faces grim, rifles raised. They were a rough-looking posse, mercenaries and angry settlers spoiling for a fight. From the south came the Lakota warriors, led by Kaga, their faces painted for battle, their movements silent and deadly. The two groups stopped, facing each other across the small clearing, with Evelyn and Takakota standing on a rocky outcrop in the center, trapped between them. It was a standoff, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. "There's the thief!" Silas roared, pointing a shaking finger at Takakota. "He's got her hypnotized! Return the girl, you savage, and we might let you live!" Kaga stepped forward, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "He is no longer one of us. He has betrayed his blood. He is yours to do with as you will. But the girl, her presence here is an insult. She must be punished for luring him from his path." Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury. They were talking about them as if they were objects, game pieces to be claimed or discarded. Before Takakota could speak, she stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the tense silence. "I am no one's prize to be claimed," she yelled, her eyes flashing. "And I was not lured or hypnotized. I came of my own free will." Her father, Jebediah, shoved his way to the front of the settler posse, his face purple with rage. "You lie! You've been bewitched! You are a disgrace to your mother's memory!" "My disgrace was living in silence!" she shouted back, the words tearing from her throat, raw and true. "My disgrace was believing the lies of a man who was too much of a coward to tell me the truth about how my mother really died." Jebediah flinched as if she'd struck him. His face went pale. Silas's eyes narrowed to slits. He knew what she was talking about. The secret was a living thing between them, and she had just dragged it into the light. A low murmur went through the Lakota warriors. Kaga's face tightened with anger. This was not going according to his plan. The girl was supposed to be a whimpering, terrified captive, not a defiant lioness. He turned his attention back to his cousin. "You see?" he called out to the other warriors. "He has filled her head with poison against her own people. He is a traitor to everything we hold sacred." Takakota stood tall, his hand resting on Evelyn's back, a silent gesture of support. He met Kaga's hateful gaze without flinching. "The only poison here, cousin, is the ambition in your heart. You have used this woman, and the hatred of these men, to try and steal what is not yours." He raised his voice, speaking to the warriors who had followed Kaga. "Look at him. Does he look like a man defending our honor, or a man seizing an opportunity?" Some of the warriors shifted uncomfortably. They had followed Kaga out of anger, but Takakota's words rang with a painful truth. Silas saw he was losing control. He raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Takakota's chest. "Enough of this talk! Give me the girl or he dies right here!" "No!" Evelyn screamed, moving to stand in front of Takakota. Everything happened at once. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Silas's rifle. It came from the trees, from the side. Silas grunted, a look of pure shock on his face, and staggered back, clutching his shoulder where a crimson flower was blooming on his shirt. An arrow. From the shadows stepped the old chief, Takakota's father, He was not supposed to be there. He was old and frail. But he held a bow in his trembling hands, and his eyes, though clouded with age, burned with a fire that had not been seen in years. He was flanked by two of his most loyal guards. "My son does not stand alone," the chief's voice, though weak, carried across the clearing. He looked at Kaga, and his gaze was filled with a terrible ancient disappointment. "And you, my brother's son, you have shamed our ancestors. You have used our enemy's hatred to fuel your own. You are no Lakota." Kaga stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His plan had crumbled to dust. At the same time, seeing Silas wounded, one of the settler men who had always been suspicious of him lowered his rifle. "Wait a minute," he said, looking from Silas to a pale-faced Jebediah. "What's the girl talking about? What happened to her mother?" Silas, clutching his bleeding shoulder, snarled, "Shut up, you fool!" But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. The alliances, built on lies and fear, were shattering. The chief took a shaky step forward. He looked from his son to Evelyn, his gaze lingering on the way they stood together, an unbreakable unit. He looked at the chaos, the two groups of armed men ready to tear each other apart. "This madness ends today," he declared. He looked directly at Evelyn's father. "Jebediah, your quarrel is not with my people. It is with the man bleeding beside you. Tell the truth. For your daughter. For your soul." Jebediah looked at his daughter's fierce, pleading eyes. He looked at the smoking rifle in Silas's hand, the man he had trusted, the man who had promised him prosperity. And finally, the dam of his lies broke. His voice was a ragged sob. "It was Silas," he choked out, the words ripping him apart. "Years ago, he wanted the land my wife's family owned. He tried to force her. She fought back and she fell. He told me the Lakota did it. He said if I told anyone, he would ruin me, say I did it myself. I was a coward. Oh God, I was a coward." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas, seeing his world collapsing, let out a roar of rage and lunged for Evelyn. But Takakota was faster. He moved like a blur, shoving Evelyn out of the way and meeting Silas's charge. The two men crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Silas's men, their loyalty now completely gone, just watched in horror. Kaga, seeing his own treachery exposed, tried to slip back into the trees. But the chief's guards were on him in an instant, seizing him. His fight was over. Takakota subdued Silas, his knife at the man's throat. The fight was drained out of the clearing, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The chief looked at Takakota and Evelyn, standing together amidst the wreckage of all the lies. He saw not a betrayal, but a bond forged in fire and truth. He raised a hand, his voice filled with a weary strength. "They will not live in our village," he said to his warriors, his gaze unwavering. "And the settlers will not take them back." He paused, his eyes finding his son's. "But if they choose to walk away from here, they will walk as one. Their path is their own. Let no one stand in their way." It was not a blessing, but it was not a curse. It was a release, an acknowledgement. In the middle of the chaos, they had been given the one thing they never thought they would have, a chance. With Silas and Kaga restrained, and the ugly truth laid bare for all to see, a strange quiet descended. There was no victory, only the sour taste of deceit. Evelyn looked at her father, a broken man weeping on the ground, and felt only a vast, empty pity. She looked at the Lakota warriors, their faces now showing confusion and shame for following Kaga. And she looked at Takakota, his knuckles bruised, his face grim, but his eyes clear. Hand in hand, they turned their backs on the smoking ruins of their old lives. They didn't look back. They walked away from the tribe that had condemned them and the town that had betrayed them. Ahead of them lay the unforgiving wilderness, No home, no people, no certainty. They had nothing left but each other. And for the first time, it felt like it might be enough. They built their life out of what the world had thrown away. In a hidden hollow, nestled between a gurgling river and a high, protective ridge, they found their sanctuary. It was a place the maps ignored, a pocket of wildness that no tribe had claimed and no settler had yet scarred with a plow. The work was brutal. They felled trees with a single axe, their hands blistering and bleeding. They hauled stones from the riverbed to build a hearth, their muscles screaming in protest. They dug the foundations of a small cabin with their bare hands, clawing a home directly from the unyielding earth. "I've never built anything real before," Evelyn said one evening, her voice rough with exhaustion. She was laughing, a sound that was still foreign and beautiful to her own ears. She looked at her hands, raw and caked with dirt. Only things that could be taken away. Lakota, his own body aching with fatigue, placed a perfectly flat stone into her hands. His touch was gentle. "Then let this be the first thing no one can touch," he said. They learned the rhythms of this new life together. He taught her which roots were safe to eat, how to weave grasses into a watertight roof, how to read the clouds to predict the weather. She taught him the words to songs her mother had sung, taught him how to laugh at the small absurdities of their Robinson Crusoe existence, how to find softness in a world that had been nothing but hard edges. They worked from sunrise to sunset, falling into their shared bed of pine boughs and firs too tired to speak. But the silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of shared purpose, of mutual survival. It was the quiet hum of two souls stitching themselves together into a single tapestry. Some nights, though, the ghosts of the past would find them. Evelyn would wake up from nightmares of Silas's cold eyes and her father's weeping face. Lakota would stand by the fire for hours, staring into the flames, the weight of the birthright he'd abandoned pressing down on him. They never spoke of these moments. They didn't have to. A shared blanket, a hand on a shoulder in the dark, these were the words they used to fight back the shadows. One afternoon, Lakota took his knife and began to carve into the thick cedar post that formed their doorway. Evelyn watched as he painstakingly etched a name into the wood. Not Evelyn. He carved the name Wiaka. She traced the strange letters with her fingertip. "What does it mean?" "It is the name the wind whispered to me for you," he said, his voice soft. "It means feather that flew against the storm." Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and sudden. Her father had given her a name, but it was just a label. Her people had given her shame. This man who had lost everything for her, had given her a new name. A name that defined her not by who she was, but by what she had overcome. "You gave me something my own people never did," she whispered, her voice thick. "A name?" he asked. "No," she said, looking around at the sturdy little cabin, at the smoke curling from their chimney, at his face, so dear to her. A place to become. But their sanctuary was not as secret as they believed. The world has a long memory for those who defy it. One morning they found tracks at the edge of the clearing. Not animal tracks, the clear imprint of a man's boot beside the hoofprint of a shod horse. They weren't from the tribe. They were from the town. They had been found. The next day, a stone landed in the center of their clearing. Tied to it with a piece of rawhide was a crude, terrifying note. The letters were jagged, carved into a piece of bark. "Return the land." He stole. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read it. "Silas," she breathed. "They didn't hold him. He's out." Takakota's face hardened into a granite mask. He wouldn't come himself. He would send men who work for money, not loyalty. He looked at the note again, his eyes narrowing. "But this is not about you. The land he stole. He's talking about my father, about the treaty." A new, cold fear gripped Evelyn. This wasn't just about revenge against her anymore. This was bigger. Silas hadn't just been after her mother's small plot of land. He had been using her father's lie as a way to invalidate the treaty between the settlers and the Lakota, to claim the entire territory was built on a foundation of native savagery. If he could prove the Lakota were murderers, the treaty would be void. All the land would be up for grabs, and she and Takakota were the only two people alive who knew the whole truth. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They were witnesses, and Silas knew it. He wasn't just trying to scare them. He was trying to erase them. "They won't stop," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They will burn this whole valley down to get what they want." "Then we won't let them," Takakota replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He looked at her, and she saw not fear in his eyes, but a cold, burning resolve. He was no longer just the man she loved. He was a warrior defending his home, his legacy, and the woman who had become his entire world. He picked up his axe, the muscles in his back cording. "We built these walls to keep the winter out," he said. "Now we make them stronger, to hold back the storm." They worked with a new, frantic urgency. They reinforced the walls of the cabin, built a concealed lookout post on the ridge, and set snares and deadfalls along the paths leading to their hollow. This was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. But as Evelyn packed mud and moss into the chinks in the log walls, a new kind of terror was blooming inside her. A private, quiet fear that had nothing to do with Silas or his men. She was late. Her monthly cycle, usually as regular as the moon, was weeks overdue. And the last time she'd been sick in the morning, it hadn't been from bad water. She was pregnant. Pregnant with the child of a disowned chief's son, in a hidden fortress, hunted by a man who would stop at nothing to see them both dead. How could she tell him? How could she bring a child into this chaos, this violence? The secret felt like a stone in her belly. One night, as they sat by the fire, Takakota suddenly went still. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening to the sounds of the night. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. "What is it?" she whispered. "A horse," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. One horse, moving slow. He rose, grabbing his bow, and melted into the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Evelyn waited, her body rigid with fear, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, Takakota returned. He was not alone. Behind him walked a figure wrapped in a heavy blanket, hunched and frail. It was an elder from his tribe. The man's face was a mask of sorrow and judgment. He stopped at the edge of the firelight, refusing to step into their circle of warmth. He would not look at Evelyn. His eyes were only for Takakota. "Your father is dying," the elder said, his voice like the scraping of stones. "The spirits are calling him. He asks to see you." Takakota stood frozen, a statue carved from grief and conflict. He had not seen his father since the day in the clearing, the day he had been cast out. The elder's gaze was cold. "He said you may come," he added, the words sharp as chips of ice, "but you will come alone. She is not welcome." The choice was a knife to the heart. His dying father, the man whose legacy he had both honored and defied, or her, the woman who was his life, his future, the mother of his unborn child. Evelyn watched him, her own heart breaking for the impossible decision he faced. "You don't have to go," she said softly, though she knew he must. "He let them turn their backs on you." "He is still my blood," Takakota murmured, his voice thick with a pain he could not hide. "And perhaps he needs to see what I became." He saddled his horse in silence. As he mounted, he looked down at her, and his eyes were filled with a universe of unspoken things. He didn't know about the baby. He didn't know the full weight of what he was leaving behind. "I will be back in 3 days," he said. It was a promise, a prayer. He rode off into the darkness, leaving her alone in their tiny fortress, with a secret in her womb and the wolves gathering in the hills. 3 days. She prayed it would be long enough. The first 2 days of his absence were an eternity of silence. Evelyn kept the fire low, spoke only to herself in whispers, and started at every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl. The loneliness was a physical weight pressing down on her. It was in this crushing silence that she finally faced the truth. She couldn't keep her pregnancy a secret. It was not just her life she was fighting for anymore. She gathered her courage. When he returned, she would tell him. They would face this new reality together, just as they had faced everything else. On the morning of the 3rd day, she heard it. Not the slow, steady hoofbeats of Takakota's horse, but the sound of multiple horses, moving fast, and the harsh, guttural laughter of men. They were here, Silas's men, and she was alone. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She scrambled up to the lookout post, her heart hammering against her ribs. Peering through a gap in the rocks, she saw them. 4 of them. Rough, grim-faced men with rifles held at the ready. They were at the bottom of the ridge, dismounting, preparing to make their way up the narrow path to the hollow. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The snares and deadfalls Takakota had set might slow them down, but they wouldn't stop them. She raced back to the cabin, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She grabbed the old, heavy rifle her father had insisted she learn to use, her hands shaking so badly she could barely load it. She had 1 shot, maybe 2 if she was lucky, 4 of them, 1 of her and 1 for the baby. The thought galvanized her. It wasn't just her life. It was their child's. A wave of pure, primal fury washed over her, drowning out the fear. They would not take her child. She would not let them. She took her position behind a barricade of logs near the cabin door, the place she and Takakota had designated as their last line of defense. She rested the heavy barrel of the rifle in a notch, took a deep, shuddering breath, and waited. The sound of their boots crunching on the gravel path grew louder, louder. Then a shout, a cry of pain, followed by a curse. One of them had found a snare. It bought her a few more precious seconds. The first man appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was big, bearded, his eyes scanning the hollow for any sign of movement. She lined up her shot, her finger trembling on the trigger, but before she could fire, an arrow whistled out of the trees and buried itself in the man's chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other men yelled in alarm, dropping into defensive crouches, firing wildly into the forest. But they were shooting at shadows. Another arrow flew and a second man went down, clutching his leg. It was Takakota. He was back, but he wasn't alone. From the trees emerged a dozen Lakota warriors, their faces painted not for battle, but with the grim symbols of justice. They moved with a silent, deadly efficiency, surrounding the 2 remaining mercenaries, their bows drawn, their expressions implacable. The mercenaries, seeing they were hopelessly outnumbered, threw down their rifles in surrender. Takakota strode into the clearing, his eyes finding Evelyn's. The relief that washed over her was so powerful her knees buckled. He ran to her, pulling her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I saw their tracks," he whispered into her hair. "I knew." Behind him, the old chief emerged from the trees, leaning heavily on the arm of a young warrior. He looked frail, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the cabin, at the reinforcements they had built, at the rifle in Evelyn's hands. He looked at her, and for the first time he truly saw her, not as the settler girl, not as the source of his son's betrayal, but as a warrior defending her home. Takakota helped his father to a log by the fire. "What happened?" Evelyn asked, her voice shaking. "He told me everything," Takakota said, his voice low and filled with a sorrow that was years deep. "On his deathbed, my father saw the truth. Kaga had been poisoning him for months, a slow poison to make his own rise to power look natural. My father realized Kaga's treachery went deeper than just me. Kaga was in league with Silas. He had promised Silas that once he was chief, he would sell him the tribe's land in exchange for guns and whiskey. The attack on us, the lies, it was all part of their plan to seize power and wealth. Evelyn stared, horrified. The web of deceit was even more tangled and rotten than she had imagined. "My father's last act," Takakota continued, his hand tightening on a carved pendant that now hung around his neck, "was to give me this, the symbol of the chief, and he told me to use it to expose the truth and save our people from the wolf within our own tribe." He had ridden back, not just for her, but for everyone. He had presented the evidence of Kaga's treachery to the council. The warriors who came with him were not there to attack her, but to defend their future chief and the woman who stood by his side. They were there to capture Silas's men and put an end to the lies once and for all. The chief beckoned Evelyn closer. His voice was a dry rattle. "My son chose you," he rasped, his old eyes finding hers. "I thought it was his weakness. I was wrong. It was his strength." He looked at her stomach, and a flicker of understanding, of ancient wisdom, crossed his face. "You carry the future now, not of one people, but of two. Protect it. It is more sacred than any land, any treaty." And then, with a final shuddering breath, the old chief closed his eyes. A great silence fell over the hollow, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Takakota knelt by his father's side, his head bowed in grief. Evelyn knelt beside him, placing her hand on his back. In the midst of death and betrayal, something new had been forged, a fragile, tentative bridge between two worlds. But as the warriors prepared to take their fallen chief and the captured mercenaries back to the village, Evelyn knew their fight was not over. Silas was still out there, and now he had nothing left to lose. The final, desperate battle was still to come. The journey back to the Lakota village was a somber procession. They carried the body of the fallen chief on a litter, a great man brought down not by age, but by betrayal. Takakota walked at the head, the chief's pendant heavy on his chest, his face a mask of grief and resolve. Evelyn rode beside him, no longer an outsider, but a silent, respected ally. The warriors who had once seen her as an enemy now looked at her with a new understanding. They had seen her ready to defend her home. They had heard the truth from their dying chief. She was Wiyaka, the feather against the storm. When they arrived, the village was in turmoil. The news of the chief's death and Kaga's ultimate treason had spread like wildfire. Kaga himself was tied to a post in the center of the village, his face bruised and swollen, his eyes burning with an impotent hatred. The truth had stripped him of all his power, leaving him naked and despised. The council of elders met immediately. Takakota stood before them, not as the prodigal son returning, but as the rightful heir demanding justice. He told them everything, about Silas's scheme, about Kaga's poison, about the lies that had nearly torn their people apart. He presented the captured mercenaries who, fearing for their lives, confessed the entire plan. The judgment was swift. Kaga was exiled, cast out to wander the wilderness alone, a man without a tribe, the worst fate a Lakota could imagine. Silas's men were to be turned over to the settlers' own justice system, with the full testimony of the tribe against them. But as the council deliberated, a scout arrived, breathless, his horse lathered in sweat. "Silas," he gasped. "He has gathered the last of his men. He has taken the settlers' fort, and he has a prisoner." A cold dread washed over Evelyn. "My father," she whispered. The scout nodded grimly. "Silas is demanding that you," he pointed to Takakota, "and you," his gaze fell on Evelyn, "come to the fort, alone. If you refuse, he will kill Jebediah and burn the fort to the ground, blaming it on a Lakota raid. He is trying to start the war he always wanted." It was a final, desperate gambit, a madman's move. Takakota turned to the warriors, his voice ringing with authority. "This is not our fight alone. Silas Mercer is an enemy to us all. He has lied to his own people, just as Kaga lied to ours. We will not meet his hatred with more hatred. We will meet his lies with truth." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes asking the question. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "He is still my father. I will not leave him to that monster." And so, an unlikely alliance was formed. A party of Lakota warriors, led by their new chief, Takakota, rode out from the village. With them rode Evelyn. They were not riding to war. They were riding to end one. The fort was a grim sight. The settlers were huddled in fear, prisoners in their own homes, while Silas's remaining handful of loyal thugs patrolled the walls, their rifles glinting in the sun. Silas himself stood on the main gatehouse, a rifle in one hand and a knife to Jebediah's throat with the other. Her father looked shrunken, defeated, a ghost of a man. "Takakota!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking with madness. "You took everything from me. The girl, the land. I'll see this whole valley burn before I let you have it." Takakota rode forward, stopping just out of rifle range. "It's over, Silas. Your men are captured. Your lies are exposed. Let him go." "Never!" Silas shrieked. "You and the girl! Come forward! Let me have my revenge!" Suddenly, a new sound was heard. The sound of dozens of horses approaching from the other side of the fort. It was the settler militia. But they weren't there to back up Silas. They were led by the man who had first questioned Silas in the clearing, his face grim. They had heard the confessions of the captured mercenaries. They knew the truth. Silas was surrounded by the people he had tried to manipulate and the tribe he had tried to destroy. His trap had become his cage. His eyes went wild. He knew it was over. With a final desperate scream of rage, he shoved Jebediah away and raised his rifle, aiming it straight at Evelyn. But her father, in a final, desperate act of redemption, lunged forward, throwing himself in front of Silas, spoiling his aim. The shot went wide. Before Silas could fire again, an arrow from Takakota's bow flew true, striking the rifle from his hand. The fight was over. The settlers swarmed the gate, taking a screaming, defeated Silas into custody. Jebediah lay on the ground, a pained look on his face. He hadn't been shot, but the fall had been hard on him. Evelyn ran to his side. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears of shame and regret. I tried," he rasped, "to protect you. Forgive me, Evelyn, for the lies, for all of it." "I forgive you," she whispered, and for the first time it was true. The hate was gone, replaced by a weary peace. In the aftermath, something new and fragile was born. The settlers and the Lakota, brought together by a common enemy, began to talk. Not with threats and demands, but with a cautious respect. They had seen the truth. They had seen that the real enemy was not the color of a man's skin, but the greed and hatred in his heart. Takakota, now the undisputed chief, led his people with a wisdom forged in fire. Evelyn stood by his side, not as a chief's wife, but as a leader in her own right, a bridge of understanding between two cultures. She told him about the baby, and the news was met not with fear, but with a fierce, protective joy. This child, their child, would not be a symbol of division. It would be the first brick in the foundation of a new world. The hollow they had built, their tiny fortress of love and defiance, became something more. It became neutral ground, a place where people could meet, trade, and learn from one another. Their home, once a symbol of their exile, was now the heart of a new beginning. Years passed. The scars on the land and on the people began to heal. A baby girl was born, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's fiery spirit. They named her Tayasi, the echo after the thunder, for she was the peace that followed the storm. One evening, Evelyn stood with Takakota on the ridge overlooking their hollow. Below, Lakota children played with settler children by the creek. A new town was growing near the old fort, a town built on cooperation, not conquest. Their daughter, Tayasi, sat between her grandfather Jebediah Now a gentle old man and a Lakota elder listening as they told her stories in two different tongues. The world they had built was not perfect. There was still prejudice, still fear, but it was a world they had chosen, a world they had fought for. Takakota wrapped his arm around her, his touch as familiar and comforting as the earth beneath her feet. "Do you remember the first day we met?" he murmured, his voice low. "By the creek?" "You shot an arrow at me," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "No," he corrected gently. "I saved you from a snake. And you?" He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a love that had weathered every storm. "You saved me from myself." She leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the world they had made, a world born from a single act of defiance, a single arrow, a love that refused to be broken. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real. They hadn't asked for permission. They had simply endured, and in doing so, they had built a legacy, not of blood or land, but of a love that was strong enough to build a new world from the ashes of the old. If you were moved by the story of Evelyn and Takakota and their fight for a love that bridged two worlds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the incredible tales of survival, justice, and impossible choices we have coming up. And let me know in the comments below, who do you think was the greater villain, Silas or Kaga? I'll see you in the next one.